a child beside a grave, and with her, a secret the village won't speak. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I'm your host, Elias Thorne. Join the mystery. Drop your location in the comments. I treasure every message you leave. Let's begin. The morning sun fell in threads of gold across the mossy stones of St. Mildred's churchyard, catching the dew still clinging to the lichen-covered markers that stood like tired sentinels over the past. The villagers of Little Compton had long accepted the churchyard as part of the village's quiet rhythm, birth, death, and the lingering pause in between. But that morning, something disturbed the stillness. It was Mrs. Weatherby, of course, who noticed first. She had a gift, if one could call it that, for arriving in places she hadn't been invited to, and for lingering just long enough to see something she shouldn't. Her Tuesday route to the post office took her past the wrought iron gate of the churchyard, where she paused, lips pursed, hand clutched around a battered shopping basket. There, sitting by the grave of Eliza Damford, dead these 3 years of a rather respectable heart attack, was a child. A girl, no more than 10 or 11, thin as a birch sapling and just as still. Her hair was dark, tied back in a ragged ribbon, and she wore a navy dress with a collar that might have once been white. The oddest thing of all was how very calm she looked. Not frightened, not lost, just waiting. Mrs. Weatherby, never one to miss a moment to collect material for a dramatic retelling, clucked her tongue and approached. "You there, dear," she said, in her sweetest tone, the one she used on prize vegetables and newcomers alike. "Are you quite all right?" The girl looked up. Her eyes were pale gray, curiously unfocused. "I'm waiting," she said simply. Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "Waiting? For whom?" The girl tilted her head as if considering the question. "He said he'd come back." Before Mrs. Weatherby could decipher who he might be, the church door creaked open and Reverend Allerton appeared, blinking against the sun. A kindly man in his 60s with eyebrows that seemed always to hover in a state of gentle surprise, he spotted the child and hurried over. "My dear child, good heavens, you gave me a start. You're not one of the Sunday school lot, are you?" The girl said nothing now. She only stood, brushed a bit of leaf from her skirt, and walked calmly past them, exiting through the gate without so much as a backward glance. "Well, I never," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, her voice a mix of delight and scandal. "What do you make of that, Vicar?" Reverend Allerton glanced toward the headstone, then down the path the girl had taken. "Very strange. I've never seen her before. Have you?" Mrs. Weatherby's expression turned solemn. "Number. But she knew someone buried here, that's for certain. Eliza Damford never had children, did she?" "None that I know of. And no relatives left. Her estate passed to the county, I believe." "I shall mention it to the Ladies' Guild," Mrs. Weatherby said with great resolve, already halfway down the lane to do exactly that. By the time the story of the child had passed through the filter of Little Compton's weekly bridge circle, she had become a pale orphan in mourning, a mute witness to a secret funeral, and, in one particularly dramatic version, a ghost. Miss Jane Marple, who had heard all 3 versions that afternoon while sipping tea in her neat little drawing room, remained thoughtfully silent through the telling. It wasn't until the others had left, Mrs. Bantry last, with her usual flurry of anecdote and interruption, that Miss Marple allowed herself to frown. It wasn't the child that troubled her. Children often said peculiar things, and grief, when young, came out sideways more often than not. No, it was the grave. Eliza Damford had lived a quiet, unassuming life. She had been a retired schoolmistress, by all accounts well-liked, though not widely loved. But even quiet lives could leave behind quiet secrets, and it was not in Miss Marple's nature to ignore a child who said she was waiting beside a grave. The following morning, Miss Marple visited the churchyard herself, under the pretext of placing fresh flowers on her late nephew's headstone. She moved slowly, as always, cane in one hand, wicker basket in the other, pausing here and there to study the markers. When she reached Eliza Damford's grave, she paused. There was something peculiar. Not about the stone, it was ordinary, just as it had been since the funeral. But beside it, nestled just beneath the edge of the soil, was the faintest impression. As if someone had been kneeling. Recently. She leaned closer and, with the edge of her cane, nudged the soil. A child's footprint, clear as day. No bigger than size 2, the heel slightly worn. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her eyes narrowing in thought. Someone had been there, someone small, but the child hadn't been lost. She hadn't looked around in confusion, nor cried. She'd said she was waiting for him, and someone, somewhere, had promised to return. Miss Marple pursed her lips and made her way back up the path. There was to be a church fete the next day, she recalled. A jumble sale, some raffles, and the inevitable cake competition. It would be, she thought, just the sort of event to bring everyone out of their homes, secrets still tucked in their coat pockets. And perhaps, if one was careful with the listening, those secrets would begin to whisper. The church fete arrived with the punctuality of the seasons, tables groaning beneath the weight of Victoria sponges and bramble jams, bunting fluttering like cheerful gossip overhead, and the villagers of Little Compton arriving in their Sunday best with coins tucked in gloved hands. From the vicar's wife to the grocer's boy, everyone turned out for the fete. It was not only an occasion to raise funds, but to be seen doing so, and in Little Compton, being seen was often more important than anything else. Miss Marple, in her dove-gray hat and lace gloves, stood quietly beside a table of embroidery samplers, her eyes not so much wandering as cataloguing. She made a few polite remarks to Mrs. Crossley about the quality of her crochet work and accepted a lukewarm cup of tea with a nod of thanks. But her gaze never left the slow, winding flow of people. She was not looking for the child, though if the girl reappeared, it would be telling. No, Miss Marple was watching for reactions. People always revealed something in how they talked about something unexpected, or didn't. Mrs. Weatherby, ever the village oracle, had by now told her story of the child so many times that its details had acquired the varnish of theatrical embellishment. Miss Marple overheard her recounting it now to young Geoffrey Pine, the solicitor's clerk, who listened with the vague amusement of youth not inclined to take elderly ladies too seriously. "She was like an angel, Geoffrey," Mrs. Weatherby said, gesturing dramatically with her teacup. "Just sitting there, patient as a saint, and when I asked her what she was doing, do you know what she said? He said he'd come back. That's what she said. Chilling, isn't it?" Geoffrey murmured, non-committally. "You're sure it was Eliza Damford's grave?" "I'm sure of what I saw. She was sitting right beside it. You remember Miss Damford, don't you? Never married, rather particular. Retired from the girls' school in Heathenley. Taught Latin and deportment, I think." Miss Marple, standing just within earshot, quietly pocketed this. Eliza Damford. The name tugged at a distant memory, some vague recollection of her being rather strict, formal, fond of church hymns in the key of G. Miss Marple had met her only a few times at Ladies' Guild meetings long before her passing, and even then Eliza had struck her as a woman who measured her words and others' morals with equal precision. Nearby, a squabble erupted over the pie competition. Mr. Holcroft, the butcher, accused Mrs. Bentley of having used store-bought pastry, which she denied with theatrical indignation. It was nothing, of course, but it served as a momentary distraction from something more curious. A man standing on the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching. Miss Marple turned her head only slightly. He was unfamiliar, tall, with a ruddy complexion, perhaps in his late 30s. His clothes were neat but not local. No one had greeted him or drawn him into conversation, and he made no effort to pretend he was part of the fete. He stood like a man scanning a shoreline for a lost sail. Then he moved, abruptly, as if he'd spotted something, and walked away down the churchyard path, disappearing between the tombstones. Miss Marple excused herself gently and followed, her pace unhurried, manner mild. When she reached the churchyard, he was gone, but someone else was there. The girl. She was seated in the same place as before, her legs folded beneath her, hands resting in her lap. Her expression was serene, so calm it was disconcerting. Miss Marple approached her slowly, her cane tapping gently against the path. "My dear," she said softly, "you've returned." The girl looked up. "He didn't come last time," she said, as though continuing a conversation already underway. "But I think he might today." Miss Marple sat on the stone bench a few feet away. "It's a lovely spot to wait," she said gently. "Were you fond of Miss Damford?" The girl shrugged. She wasn't very nice, but he liked her. "Who, may I ask, is he?" The girl gave no name, only looked toward the lane where the faint sounds drifted like smoke. "He used to come here, when it was quiet. They talked about things. She helped him." "Helped him how?" The girl's hands tightened slightly. She knew secrets. She wrote them down. Miss Marple did not press. Children, like startled birds, would often fly off if one approached too suddenly. Instead, she offered a smile. "Do you live nearby?" The girl hesitated. "I go where I'm told, not always the same place." Before Miss Marple could continue, the girl stood suddenly. "I have to go now." She was gone before Miss Marple could rise to follow. Miss Marple sat in stillness for a moment longer, then turned her eyes to the grave. Something the child had said. She wrote them down. A former schoolmistress, alone in her cottage for years. She would have kept letters, journals, notes, especially if she felt those secrets were dangerous or dear. Miss Marple rose slowly, her joints protesting. The fete was beginning to dwindle. It was nearly 4 o'clock, and soon only crumbs and gossip would remain. But Miss Marple had a destination in mind. Eliza Damford's old cottage, now shuttered and under the care of the county council. Back through the church path she went, stopping just long enough to murmur a question to Mrs. Bantry, who was delicately removing the second prize ribbon from her carrot cake with practiced modesty. "My dear Dolly, who handles the keys to Miss Damford's property these days?" Mrs. Bantry arched a brow. "Why, that would be Mr. Turrell. He's the clerk for the county holdings, retired tax assessor, lives above the chemist." Miss Marple smiled. "How very sensible. And his niece, what's her name again?" "Works at the library." "Celia. Excellent memory, as always, dear." That evening, after supper and a small brandy to keep the chill off, Miss Marple took out a sheet of notepaper and wrote a delicate note to Celia Turrell, requesting the possible use of the keys to Miss Damford's cottage for a harmless inspection related to the Women's Institute's local history pamphlet project. An invention which, Miss Marple felt, would both flatter and disarm. She folded the note, sealed it with wax, and set it by the door to deliver first thing in the morning. And then, cane resting against the arm of her chair, she sat back and folded her hands, her blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Because someone had been watching the grave, someone who did not belong. And somewhere in that quiet, shuttered cottage, the secrets of a stern schoolmistress and the reason a strange child waited beside her grave were waiting too. The morning after the fete was crisp, the air laced with the scent of dew-soaked hedgerows and wood smoke curling faintly from distant chimneys. Miss Marple, punctual as sunrise and precise as a well-stitched hem, stepped out onto the lane with her note in hand. She made her way toward the library, a modest building with ivy curling around its windows and a chime that jangled delicately as she entered. Celia Turrell, slender and bookish, looked up from the returns desk with a smile that flickered between politeness and wariness. She was a practical young woman in her late 20s, with hair perpetually slipping from its pins and a voice that always sounded like it had just asked someone to speak more quietly. "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning. Were you after the bygone Devon volume again?" Miss Marple offered a kindly smile. "Not this time, dear. I wonder if I might trouble you with something slightly unconventional." She handed over the sealed note, watching as Celia read it with a slight furrow between her brows. When she looked up again, her expression had shifted into something more guarded. "I suppose I can ask Uncle Arthur. He doesn't really like people poking around, though, especially since the burglary last year." "Burglary?" Miss Marple echoed, gently surprised. Celia hesitated, lowering her voice. "It wasn't widely spoken of. Just some papers disturbed, a drawer forced, but nothing taken. Uncle Arthur said it looked like someone was searching for something. We assumed it was vagrants." "Very curious," Miss Marple murmured, her tone mild. "Was this soon after Miss Damford's death?" "About 2 weeks, I think. The estate hadn't even been properly transferred yet." Miss Marple offered a thoughtful hum. "I see. Would you be very kind and ask your uncle about the key? If there's any concern, I'd be happy to speak to him directly. Just a brief look is all I need, I assure you. Historical curiosity, nothing more." Celia studied her for a moment, then nodded. "He's usually home after lunch. I'll tell him you're coming." By 2:30, Miss Marple had made her way to the flat above the chemist's, where Mr. Arthur Turrell answered the door in a cardigan stretched at the elbows and a suspicious look in his pale blue eyes. He was the sort of man who had once enjoyed rules more than people and hadn't quite adjusted to retirement. "I don't know what you think you'll find," he said as he locked the drawer of his writing desk. "But I suppose if Celia trusts you—" "Only a brief visit," Miss Marple promised. "I've always found old houses speak if one listens with the right sort of ear." Mr. Turrell grunted and handed over the tarnished brass key. "There's not much to see. The place is dusty as a chapel bell tower and no power since they cut it off last autumn." Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave, the key tucked in her reticule beside a small torch and a pair of cotton gloves. By 3:15, she stood before Miss Damford's cottage, a modest structure at the edge of the village, surrounded by overgrown hedges and a garden that had gone riotously wild without supervision. The front door creaked open with a hesitant groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, lavender sachets, and the faint must of disuse. Dust motes danced in the light from the windows, and silence pressed against the walls like forgotten breath. Miss Marple moved slowly, her steps careful. The sitting room was just as one might expect, tidy but impersonal, with rigid furniture and framed watercolors of Devonshire scenes. A vase of dried lavender sat brittle on the mantel, and beside it, a photograph of a woman in a teaching gown, her mouth drawn into a line of reluctant patience. The desk in the corner drew Miss Marple's eye. It had been rifled through, once, clumsily. A drawer handle showed signs of having been pried, and papers, though stacked, bore the signs of having been disturbed and reassembled hastily. She sifted through the top layer. School certificates, letters from former pupils, a photograph of a young woman in uniform, but nothing suggested significance. She moved next into the bedroom. There, tucked in the back of the wardrobe behind moth-eaten cardigans and neatly folded scarves, she found a biscuit tin. Miss Marple carried it to the bed and opened it slowly. Inside were letters, all tied in bundles with twine, dozens of them, some addressed to Eliza. Some from her. Most were innocuous, postmarked from various corners of the country, full of news about students, recipes, and local gossip. But one stood out. It was addressed to Eliza Damford from a place called Greyston Hill School, dated 22 years prior. "Dear Miss Damford, thank you for agreeing to consult discreetly on the matter of the girl's placement. Given the circumstances surrounding her parentage, it is imperative that the family name not appear on any of her records. The father has arranged for a stipend to be issued annually, as you suggested. As always, your discretion and judgment are greatly appreciated. Yours sincerely, E. Templeton. Miss Marple read it twice, then slipped it into her handbag. A girl, hidden. A father, unnamed. A stipend paid. She rose, returning the tin carefully to its place. On her way out, she passed through the tiny parlor again, pausing by the fireplace. There, just above the mantel, hung a small oil painting of the churchyard. The stones had been stylized, but one stood in clear relief, the marker belonging to Eliza Damford, and next to it, barely noticeable unless one knew to look, the faint outline of a child. The hairs on the back of Miss Marple's neck tingled. Not a ghost. No, not that. But someone years ago had made a record of a moment, of a presence, perhaps of a promise. She locked the door behind her, drawing the key out slowly. Someone had searched this house after Eliza's death, believing something was hidden here, and perhaps it had been, but they had not known where to look. Miss Marple walked back toward the village, her mind ticking gently. A girl who said she was waiting, a man seen watching the fete, and a letter pointing to a child deliberately concealed. It was not a murder yet, but it had the shape of one, or the memory of one, or perhaps the preparation for one. At home, Miss Marple prepared tea with her usual precision, setting a single digestive biscuit on the saucer and placing her gloves to dry by the radiator. She opened her notebook and wrote only 3 lines. Grayston Hill School, E. Templeton. Girl placed anonymously 22 years ago. Then she underlined them once and sat back to listen to the wind scratching lightly at the window pane. Somewhere, someone else had begun moving again, unsettled by the return of a child who should not have returned, and the woman who once held their secret now cold in her grave. But secrets did not stay buried in Little Compton, not when Jane Marple had started to listen. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to let a thread dangle untugged, not when it hinted at something buried. The next morning, she rang up the telephone exchange and, with soft courtesy and an insistence too delicate to argue with, requested the number for Grayston Hill School. The operator, Edna, who had once made the mistake of calling Miss Marple dear in public, complied without protest. Within the hour, Miss Marple was on the line with the school secretary, a clipped-voiced woman named Mrs. Haycroft. Yes, we had a Mr. Templeton as headmaster some years ago, she confirmed. Retired now, lives in Torquay, I believe. But I don't see how— Oh, just a matter of historical interest, Miss Marple interrupted sweetly. We're compiling a booklet for our local women's institute. Contributions made by educators to rural society, that sort of thing. Well, Mrs. Haycroft said, her tone grudgingly mollified, I can forward a letter if you wish. We don't give out personal addresses. That would be most helpful. Miss Marple thanked her and rang off. She made a neat note beside Mr. Templeton's name in her notebook and circled it. The retired headmaster might remember Eliza Damford, or the child in question, or, if fortune was feeling generous, the father who had arranged for secrecy. But fortune, Miss Marple knew, was rarely generous. It was far more often shy and suspicious, like a hedgehog curled beneath a rhubarb patch. As she returned the notebook to its drawer, the doorbell rang. It was Dolly Bantry, half excited, half bewildered, and unmistakably about to deliver something worth hearing. I've just had the strangest encounter, she declared, sweeping in without waiting to be asked. That man, tall, ruddy-faced, definitely not local. I saw him again. He was loitering by the post office, then made straight for the churchyard again. Looked like he meant business, not a mourner's pace at all. Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea and set it down for her friend. And did you speak to him? He didn't give the impression of wanting company. Besides, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know what he was about. He had that look men sometimes get when they think something slipped out of their reach. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her eyes lowered. A man searching for something lost can be quite unpredictable. Did you notice where he went afterward? Dolly shook her head. No, I turned off toward the market. But, Jane, what if he's the one the child was waiting for? Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. That would be a curious twist, wouldn't it? A child who knows something, a man who fears what she knows. She's so calm, though, Dolly mused. That girl, almost unnatural. I dare say she gives me a shiver. Children see differently, I think. And when they are told not to speak, they often find ways of being heard all the same. They sipped their tea in silence, the afternoon sun slanting long through the lace curtains. 2 hours later, Miss Marple was seated in the vicarage study across from Reverend Allerton, who looked unusually grave. I hesitate to trouble you with something not yet a crime, Miss Marple, he began, folding his fingers beneath his chin. But it concerns the child. She was seen again this morning. Miss Marple tilted her head. By the grave? Numbers in the church itself. Mrs. Goff came to polish the brass, and she found the girl sitting in the last pew. Just sitting. When asked what she was doing, she said, listening. Then she left without fuss. Mrs. Goff was quite unnerved. She's not a ghost, Miss Marple said gently. She's a message, or rather, the bearer of one. She doesn't belong here, Allerton said quietly, but someone does. I think she's tethered to someone in the village. Miss Marple thought of the letter, the anonymous placement, the stipend, the faint kneeling print by Eliza's grave. I believe, she said softly, Eliza Damford may have kept the child's secret for many years. Now that she's gone, the child has returned to find something or someone left behind. The vicar nodded, troubled. I don't like the feeling it gives me, Jane. Nor I, she said. But I intend to find out what it is that's been hiding in plain sight all this time. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the records office, a room adjacent to the library, often overlooked, with musty volumes cataloguing everything from property deeds to marriage bans. She pulled the register for 1943, then 1944, then 1945, scanning for Eliza Damford's name. She found it listed several times in the capacity of witness or local contact for girls transferred from other towns, but nothing definitive. She nearly missed it, a margin note scrawled beside one line. Damford received stipend. Minor unregistered. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. No name, no birth record. A child taken in with no official status. Legally invisible. But why? What could be so dangerous about the child's origins that her identity had to vanish? The answer came not with a bang, but with a whisper, as they so often did. The next day brought a letter, forwarded from Greyston Hill. Mr. Templeton's handwriting was formal but still strong. Dear Madam, I recall Miss Damford well, a woman of formidable standards. She consulted me once regarding a matter of considerable discretion involving a man of influence. A member of Parliament at the time, though I shall not name him in case of libel. He had fathered a child under circumstances that would, if revealed, have ended his career. Miss Damford agreed to arrange for the child's quiet placement and education. She was never adopted, merely passed between caretakers. I do not know what became of the gentleman, save that he continued paying the agreed sum until Miss Damford's death. I hope this is of some assistance. Yours respectfully, E. Templeton. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. A man of influence, a child born in secrecy, a life built on silence. But the silence had broken. She opened her notebook once more and wrote a single line beneath the others. A member of Parliament, still living. Then, with care, she added, the man at the fete. Watching the grave. Watching the girl. She closed the book. She had the shape now, the silhouette of a concealed scandal, a man desperate not to be seen, a child conditioned to wait, but there was one piece missing still. Why now? What had changed in the quiet grave of Eliza Damford that had pulled all the strings loose? She did not yet have the answer, but she suspected it would come soon. Because secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a curious way of revealing themselves, not when convenient, but when it became impossible for them to remain hidden any longer. Late that same afternoon, as the first hints of mist began to drift low over the hedgerows and the village rooftops wore a sheen of quiet silver, Miss Marple took a slow walk to the churchyard once more. Her steps were unhurried, deliberate, the sort of pace that invited conversation or confession, depending on who one met along the way. But the path was empty today. The fete bunting had been taken down. No footsteps but her own marred the gravel. She paused by Eliza Damford's grave. The headstone was just as it had been, dignified, modest, bearing the inscription, "Her mind was her strength." A few wilted flowers leaned against its base, probably from the church fete, left by a former pupil or a guilty niece. There was no sign of the child, nor of the man. Miss Marple stayed only a moment, then turned back and made her way toward the post office. It was nearly closing time, and Mr. Clark, who managed it with military precision and very little humor, was busy sorting the last of the outgoing letters. But when Miss Marple entered, he softened visibly, as he always did when addressed with a gentle blend of authority and delicacy. "Ah, Miss Marple, anything you require?" "I wonder, Mr. Clark," she said, "do you happen to recall if any letters or packages have arrived recently for Miss Damford's address? I know it's unoccupied now, of course, but some things can go astray." Clark frowned. "There was one, a registered envelope, oddly enough, arrived 2 days ago from London. I've held it aside, wasn't sure where to redirect it. May I see it?" He hesitated, then disappeared into the back room. A moment later, he returned with a buff envelope. The handwriting was unremarkable, but the return address was Mayfair, Waddington House, a name that stirred something faint in Miss Marple's memory. She tucked that thought away for later. "I don't suppose," she asked gently, "you noticed who brought it?" Clark looked affronted. It was a uniformed courier, National Dispatch. Quite official. Miss Marple nodded and left, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A registered envelope arriving after Eliza Damford's death, addressed to her name. From Mayfair. She returned home and placed the kettle on. While it boiled, she went to the bookshelf and retrieved an old copy of Who's Who in Parliament. It was the 1952 edition, but it would do. She thumbed through it until she found Waddington House. There, Sir Alan Hexam, minister without portfolio under the previous government. Married, knighted, no children listed. Miss Marple folded her hands and let the quiet fill the room. Sir Alan Hexam had paid for a child to be hidden, a child whose existence, if revealed, might ruin reputations. And now that Eliza Damford was gone, something, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, had stirred the man into action, but he hadn't come himself. Number he had watched, waited, and someone else had sent that envelope. The knock at the door came as dusk crept in. When Miss Marple opened it, the last person she expected stood on the step. It was the girl. She looked smaller now, standing alone in the falling light, as if the day had drained some of the quiet strength from her. She held nothing in her hands, her posture poised but uncertain. I'm not supposed to talk to people," she said softly. Miss Marple stepped aside. "Then you may simply listen, or rest if that's what you need." The girl entered without a word. Miss Marple led her to the sitting room, where the tea tray was already prepared. She poured a cup and handed it to her, the saucer steady in her own hand. After a few sips, the girl looked up. "They said if anyone found out who I was, he'd go away. The man who visits. Do you know his name? The girl shook her head. He's not allowed to tell me. I'm not allowed to know things. Miss Marple sat opposite her, not too close. But you remember Miss Damford? The girl nodded. She was kind. Not nice, but kind. She made rules. I liked that. Did she tell you to come here, to return? The girl hesitated. Then, very quietly, she said, she wrote a letter. A long one. It said, "Go to the place where I rest. The truth will find its way to you." So I came. Miss Marple's breath caught, just slightly. Where's the letter now? The girl blinked, her voice quieter still. I tore it up. I was afraid someone else would read it, but I remember what it said. They sat in silence for a long moment, the crackle of the fire filling the air. Do you remember your name? Miss Marple asked gently. The girl looked down at her tea. It changes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the man? She looked toward the window, her voice almost a whisper. He cried once. In the church, but only a little. The kettle hissed softly on the stove behind them. Miss Marple knew now that she would need to speak to Sir Alan Hexam. Not formally. That would only make him retreat further into his armor of privilege and discretion. But she could find her way to him, not as an accuser, but as someone who had seen too much of human frailty to be shocked by it. She stood. I think it's time we found you a safe place to stay for the night. You'll come with me to the vicarage. They'll look after you until we know more. The girl hesitated, then rose. Will he be angry? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. He may be frightened, but people who carry secrets always are. They left together through the front gate, the mist rising around them like breath made visible. Miss Marple kept a steady hand on the girl's back, guiding her toward the faint, warm glow of the church tower in the distance. The secret had stepped into the open now, and secrets, once they tasted air, seldom returned to silence. Reverend Allerton received them at the vicarage with more grace than surprise, as though Miss Marple's appearance at dusk with a strange child in tow were merely the natural course of events in Little Compton. He led them through to the sitting room, where a lamp glowed with a soft amber light, and the scent of pipe smoke lingered faintly in the air. Mrs. Allerton, ever composed, appeared within moments, bearing a tray with warm milk and shortbread, making no remark about the girls. Presence beyond a gentle, "You must be tired, dear. You'll stay in the guest room tonight." Miss Marple remained just long enough to ensure the girl had settled by the hearth before she drew the vicar aside. "I believe," she said softly, "that we are no longer merely in the realm of local curiosity. This child has returned to uncover something that a very important man has spent years ensuring would remain hidden, and I rather think she is in danger." The vicar's face paled slightly. "Do you know who the man is?" "I believe so. Sir Alan Hexam, former minister without portfolio. His name is tied to the address that sent a registered letter to Eliza Damford's cottage after her death, which tells us something, doesn't it?" "That he didn't know she was gone." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "And that someone else has taken over where she left off, or has taken something she meant to pass along." She took a folded paper from her handbag and handed it to him. "Say, the copy of Mr. Templeton's letter." The vicar read it with furrowed brows, his lips thinning into a grim line. "A child hidden," he said quietly. "Out of shame, or ambition, or fear. And now she has reappeared," said Miss Marple, as calm as the grave she sat beside. "I believe she thinks she's fulfilling a promise, though I don't believe anyone ever gave it to her aloud." The vicar looked through the archway toward the drawing room, where the child sat quietly with a biscuit in her lap, staring at the flames. "She's too composed for her age," he said. "Children who have been conditioned not to exist often are." They agreed she would stay the night under the care of the Allertons. Miss Marple promised to return first thing in the morning. As she stepped out into the fog-heavy air, the sky softening into indigo, she noticed a shadow moving along the hedge line by the churchyard. It wasn't merely the wind. The shape was purposeful, angled, watching. She didn't startle. She walked directly to the gate and opened it without hurry, letting it creak just enough to signal presence. The figure straightened. He was there again. The man. The one from the fete. No longer just observing, now clearly waiting. She approached him gently, her hands folded over the handle of her cane. "Good evening," she said pleasantly. "You've been seen before, haven't you? Watching the grave. And the girl." He hesitated. Then, in a voice that belonged more in drawing rooms than alleyways, he said, "I didn't mean to frighten anyone. I only wanted to be sure she was all right." "Then you do know her?" His mouth twitched. "I knew of her. Years ago." Miss Marple studied him. He was not nervous in the usual way, not the way guilty men tremble. But he carried the discomfort of someone who had spent his life giving orders and was now, for the first time, unsure how to ask a question. "She is safe," Miss Marple said, quietly. "For the moment." He closed his eyes briefly. "Does she know who I am?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "But she knows someone was meant to return, someone who didn't." His jaw clenched. "I never meant to abandon her." "But you did, or someone ensured that you did." "I paid," he said, the words coming out bitterly. "I arranged everything. She was supposed to be placed quietly, cared for. That woman, Damford, she promised. She kept your promise, I believe. Until she died." He looked at her, and in the dusk, his eyes were suddenly tired. "What happens now?" "That depends on what you came back for." He didn't answer. Miss Marple's voice softened. "Did you receive a letter recently?" He frowned. "No." "Then someone sent one in your name," she said, "to Eliza's cottage, after her death." His silence was all the confirmation she needed. "There is someone else involved," she continued. "Someone who knew of the child, who perhaps hoped to retrieve what Miss Damford hid, or destroy it. Do you think the girl's in danger?" "I do," she said, "and I believe you know what that danger looks like." He hesitated. Then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small weathered envelope. "This arrived 2 weeks ago. No return address, just said, 'She knows.' I thought. I wasn't sure if it was a threat or a plea, but I came. I had to see for myself." Miss Marple took the envelope. Inside was a single scrap of paper with 3 words in a child's looping script. "You promised me." They stood in silence a moment. The mist curled around the gravestones. The village lights a faint flicker behind them. "Sir Alan," she said finally, and he flinched at the sound of his name. "I think it's time you came inside. Not to her, not yet, but to me. There are still things I need to understand, and I think deep down you wish to be understood." He gave a shallow nod. Inside her sitting room, she prepared tea again, this time with a firmer hand, and set it before him without ceremony. "You were never meant to be found out, were you?" she said. "No," he admitted. "It was handled, quietly. Her mother was someone I cared for once. I couldn't offer her my name, but I didn't want to disappear entirely either. I thought paying meant doing the right thing. It often doesn't." He nodded grimly. "And now she's here, after all this time." "She's here," Miss Marple said gently, "because someone let her believe she had been promised a reunion, and now someone else is trying to silence that belief. She thinks I'm coming for her. She's not wrong." He looked into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Will she hate me?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. "Not at first. Children don't hate easily, but they remember, especially when silence is all they were given." He exhaled. "What should I do?" "You should tell the truth. Not to the public, not to the press, but to her, first, before someone else tells her something crueler." Outside, the church bell struck 9, low and mournful. Miss Marple sat back, watching him, because the pieces were shifting now. The girl was not just a symbol, not just a mystery. She was a witness, and someone out there, someone who had sent that envelope, someone who had broken into the cottage, someone who feared what the child might remember, was no longer watching. They were preparing to act. By the following morning, the mood in Little Compton had shifted in ways most villagers could not name, though many sensed it. The bakery queue was quieter than usual, conversations slower, glances exchanged a shade more warily. Something unsaid hung in the air, like the hush before a bell tolls or the moment just before rain. Miss Marple moved through it all with her usual quiet determination, stopping first at the vicarage to check on the girl. She found her in the sunlit drawing room, seated beside Mrs. Allerton with a book open on her lap. She was not reading, just holding it, as if pretending for the benefit of those who didn't know better. "She slept," Mrs. Allerton whispered when she met Miss Marple in the hallway. "Fitfully, but no tears, no questions either." "She's waiting for something," Miss Marple said softly. "Still, even now. But I think we are near to giving her what she's owed." "She's terribly still," Mrs. Allerton murmured, "like she's rehearsing stillness." "That's how children survive uncertainty," Miss Marple replied. "They become shadows until someone remembers to turn on the light." Sir Alan Hexam had agreed to wait until Miss Marple sent for him. For now, he remained at the inn under a borrowed name, keeping to his room and writing, whether letters or confessions, Miss Marple could not guess. But she sensed he would not run. Not now. What unsettled her most, however, was the envelope. Not the message it contained, but the question it posed. Who had sent it? If not Sir Alan, then someone else. Someone with knowledge of the girl of the past, and perhaps of what had been hidden in Eliza Damford's care. Miss Marple returned home and sat at her writing desk, surrounded by quiet. She opened her notebook, reading over the names again. Eliza Damford, E. Templeton, Sir Alan Hexam, the unnamed mother, the child, and now a new figure, an unseen correspondent who wanted the girl to believe her abandonment had been deliberate. She thought back to the burglary, Mr. Turrell's mention of drawers, forced, nothing stolen. They hadn't been looking for valuables. They'd been looking for evidence. Someone had wanted to erase something, and when they failed, they had tried to turn the girl's return into a weapon. At 2:30, Miss Marple made her way to the library. Celia Turrell was at her usual post, rearranging the returns shelf. She looked up with polite surprise as Miss Marple approached. "Celia, dear," Miss Marple said in her warmest tone. "I wonder if I might ask something a little peculiar." "Of course," Celia replied, setting aside a copy of a child's garden of verses. "You mentioned your uncle was upset by the burglary last year. Do you recall if anything ever came of it? A report or an insurance claim?" Celia looked puzzled but not suspicious. "No, there was no claim. Uncle Arthur said the damage was minimal, and there wasn't much worth stealing anyway." "But the papers were disturbed?" "Yes. The desk drawers in the front room were opened. He was furious." "Did he mention whether he had ever spoken to Miss Damford about the child?" Celia blinked. "The child?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "I ask because I've come to believe she was someone Eliza protected, and someone else has taken a very strong interest in ensuring that story never sees daylight." Celia's expression changed. Not frightened, but something close to wary curiosity. Uncle knew Eliza, of course. They were both in the council committee for historical preservation. I used to hear them talking about school policy sometimes, and after she died, he went to the cottage once or twice. "Alone?" "I think so. Though now that you mention it, I do remember someone came to see him about a week later. A woman, smartly dressed, not local. They had a very tense conversation in the hallway. I remember thinking she didn't seem the kind who comes to Little Compton without a reason." "Did you catch her name?" "Number, but I remember the envelope she carried. It had a seal, some sort of crest on it. It looked official. Government, maybe." Miss Marple felt a quiet chill run through her. Someone had come down from London days after Eliza Damford's death and had spoken with Arthur Tyrrell, someone who might have been connected to Sir Alan's circle, or perhaps had worked to keep his affairs managed and buried. If that person had also sent the envelope to the cottage under Sir Alan's name, it would suggest a far more deliberate manipulation. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple waited only long enough to brew a fresh pot of tea before picking up the telephone. Sir Alan answered on the third ring. "Sir Alan, I believe someone close to you is working against you." He didn't ask who she was or what she meant. His voice dropped to a weary murmur. "I wondered. I suspected even, but I didn't think they'd go so far as to threaten her. They haven't harmed her, not yet, but they're trying to position you as the villain in your daughter's story." She heard the silence on the line deepen. "She's my child," he said finally. "I should have come for her myself, but I let them manage it. And someone in that circle has continued managing it. Only now, their concern is not for the child, but for your reputation." "I can guess who," he said. "There were always protectors, people who made sure inconvenient things were handled. I think one of them has begun acting independently. You must be careful." He hesitated. "Do you want me to come now?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Not yet. First, we need to confirm who else knew about the child. I believe your daughter is in more danger from someone trying to erase the past than from being reunited with it." That evening, Miss Marple went once more to the churchyard. The light was fading again. A breeze moved gently across the grass, rustling the hedges and the ivy clinging to the headstones. She wasn't surprised when she saw the girl standing there. "I thought you might come," Miss Marple said. "I always come when it's quiet," the girl answered. "Are you still waiting?" The girl looked at her. "He didn't break the promise. Someone else did." "You're right," Miss Marple said. "And I believe the person who broke it is afraid of what you might remember." The girl tilted her head. "Like what? Do you remember anyone who used to visit Miss Damford, other than the man?" The girl considered. "A woman, always with a folder. She smiled a lot, but she didn't mean it." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "Do you remember her name?" The girl looked at the sky. "Miss Langford." It was spoken like a spell, as if kept hidden for years in some far corner of her mind. Miss Marple knew the name. She had read it once in a paper, attached to an aide in the Ministry of Domestic Affairs. A fixer, they had called her. A woman who smoothed wrinkles before they became scandals. The same woman, most likely, who had visited Arthur Tyrrell, who had written the forged letter, who had realized the child had returned. Someone who knew too much and needed the past buried. Miss Marple took the girl's hand gently. "You've done what you were meant to. You've remembered." The wind moved again through the grass, and behind them, unseen, the first shadow of real danger slipped between the stones. The breeze had stiffened to a chill by the time Miss Marple and the girl turned from the grave and began the walk back to the vicarage. The child walked quietly, her hand still in Miss Marple's, her gait unhurried, composed, but no longer detached. Something had shifted in her, a subtle change of posture, as though a weight had been lifted from the center of her chest. She had remembered the woman's name. And for a child who had lived her life erased from documents and conversation, the power of remembering was no small thing. Miss Marple remained silent as they reached the iron gate and passed through, but her eyes flicked once toward the dark line of yew trees that bordered the churchyard. A second earlier, she thought she had seen movement, just a sliver of darkness gliding between trunks. But it was gone now. She did not mention it. At the vicarage, Mrs. Allerton met them with quiet relief and ushered the girl inside, already fussing over warm cocoa and drawing the curtains tight. Miss Marple lingered in the hallway, politely refusing the offer of supper, her mind already racing ahead. She returned home just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The air was thick with it, and the windows trembled faintly with each gust. She sat by the fire, dry now but tense, and drew her notebook onto her lap. The name Langford sat at the top of the page in her even script. Under it, a question. What is she willing to do? Miss Langford was no longer working in the ministry. Not officially. But whispers remained. She had been responsible for private inquiries on behalf of several prominent figures over the years. She had been careful, but not invisible, and the girl had remembered her, which meant Miss Langford's anonymity had slipped, and that, for someone like her, would be unacceptable. Miss Marple stood and walked to her sideboard, retrieving the telephone book. She flipped through the thin pages until she found the number she wanted. Celia Turrell. She rang at once. Celia answered on the second ring, her voice slightly strained. "Miss Marple, I was just about to call you." "Oh? There's something I didn't mention earlier. I thought it unimportant at the time, but this woman you asked about, the one who visited Uncle Arthur, I saw her again this evening. She came into the library just before closing." Miss Marple felt her fingers tighten slightly on the receiver. "Did she speak to you?" "Number?" She stood near the window and watched the square. Then she asked for a map, something detailed of the village. She said she was visiting a relative and wanted to walk the footpaths. She didn't give a name, but it was her. "Did she leave with the map?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I believe she's searching, and she now knows the girl is here." There was a pause. "Miss Marple, do you think she'd hurt her?" "I think Miss Langford has spent her life ensuring secrets stay buried, and now one of them has surfaced in a child who remembers her." Miss Marple thanked her and rang off. She returned to her armchair and sat in stillness, watching the fire flicker. She felt no fear, only clarity. There was no time left for speculation. She would speak to Sir Alan at once. She took her shawl, her cane, and a small silver whistle she kept in a lacquered box, something her nephew Raymond had once given her, in case of overzealous squirrels, he'd joked. She tucked it into her bag. The inn was only a short walk, even in the rain. When she arrived, the innkeeper, Mr. Lacey, greeted her with discreet concern. "He's upstairs," he said quietly. "Not taken supper. Asked for tea and a bottle of scotch." Miss Marple ascended the narrow stairs slowly, her cane tapping rhythmically. At the end of the corridor, room 4's door stood half ajar. She knocked gently, then entered. Sir Alan sat in the armchair by the hearth, his jacket draped over the bedpost. He looked up as she entered, and though his face was drawn, he rose at once. "She remembers Langford," Miss Marple said without preamble. He didn't look surprised, only very tired. "She's here, isn't she?" he said. "Langford, I wondered. I didn't think she'd come herself." "She came to the library asking for a village map," Miss Marple said, "which tells me she doesn't know where the girl is. Not yet, but she's close." Sir Alan poured 2 small glasses of scotch and handed one to Miss Marple, who accepted it, though she would leave it untouched. "She was always the quiet one," he said. "When everyone else panicked, she acted. The child's placement, the false identity, she orchestrated it all. She never told me where the girl was sent, just that it was handled. That's what she always said, handled." Miss Marple studied him. "Do you believe she means the child harm?" "I believe she means to eliminate risk." He turned to the window and looked out into the rain. "Never asked what handled truly meant. I was a coward. I paid. I signed things. I kept my seat. And now I see what she turned it into." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unwavering. "The girl needs you, not as a benefactor, not as a name on a ledger, as someone who chooses her. You must come to the vicarage. Tonight, before Langford does." He nodded slowly, then looked at her with something like fear. "What if she hates me?" "She doesn't. She's waiting for you." They left the inn at once, walking beneath the lamplight, the rain easing into mist. Miss Marple walked ahead, her cane steady. Sir Alan followed, his hands clenched in his coat pockets. As they turned onto the lane by the church, Miss Marple suddenly stopped. Something shifted in the air, a footstep behind them, too light for Alan's tread. She turned just in time to glimpse the edge of a figure disappear behind the low wall near the graveyard gate. She reached into her bag and pulled the whistle. One sharp, piercing note cut through the mist. Seconds later, a light flared in the vicarage window. The front door opened. Reverend Allerton stepped out into the night, calling, "Jane!" "We're here," she called back, and her voice was surprisingly calm. "And we're being followed." Sir Alan turned sharply. The figure by the wall did not emerge, but they had seen her silhouette, and it was no longer a question. Langford had come, and now, with the child waiting by the fire and the past converging at last, the hour had arrived when everything that had been hidden must step into the light. The rain had stopped, but its ghost still clung to the air, as though the village held its breath beneath a film of mist. Sir Alan stood stiffly beneath the portico of the vicarage, his face pale beneath the brass porch lamp. He looked older than he had, the day before, as if each step toward his daughter took a year off the pretense he had worn for decades. Reverend Allerton waved them inside without fuss. Miss Marple followed, her expression composed, though her eyes flicked once more toward the hedge where Langford had vanished. It wasn't bravery that guided her, nor even urgency. It was inevitability. The truth was near now. It had crept and curled and pressed its way toward them, and now it stood poised at the edge of a child's quiet expectation. The girl sat in the drawing room, just as she had that morning. She wore the same navy dress with the frayed hem and held her hands clasped on her knees, as if anticipating a verdict. She didn't look up when they entered. Not at first. Sir Alan stepped forward slowly, his voice caught somewhere between apology and awe. "Hello." The girl raised her head. She looked at him, not startled, not angry, just looking as though measuring the man against the silhouette she had carried in her mind. "You came," she said. "I'm sorry it took so long." She tilted her head slightly. "You used to leave stones by the bench. Miss Damford said they meant you were still watching." His breath caught, and Miss Marple, standing quietly behind them, saw him place one hand against the doorframe to steady himself. "Yes," he said. "That was me." The girl looked down at her lap. "I kept waiting, even when the letters stopped." "I didn't know," he said. "They told me you'd been moved, that you were safe. They told me I shouldn't get involved directly, that I'd only make things worse." "I thought I'd done something wrong," the girl said, and her voice wavered for the first time. "I thought if I was better, you would come." Miss Marple stepped forward then, her voice calm, firm. "You were a child. Children cannot be blamed for the cowardice of grown men, nor the manipulations of those who serve them." Sir Alan looked down, and for a moment said nothing. Then he crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "I didn't come because I was afraid," he said, "afraid of what I would lose. My name, my career, my family. My wife knew nothing. I told myself I was protecting you. But really I was protecting myself." The girl looked at him, her pale eyes unreadable. "And now I want you to know I see you. I remember you. I never forgot." She studied him for a moment longer. Then, without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small white stone, smooth and round. She placed it gently on the windowsill beside her. Miss Marple, watching, said nothing. She only felt in some quiet part of her heart the echo of something being laid to rest. But the moment was not allowed to linger. A knock sounded at the door, not a hesitant one. Sharp, precise. Mrs. Allerton opened it, and the woman who stood there was just as Miss Marple had remembered from the dossiers and mentions in the papers. tailored coat, gloves, a handbag that looked heavy enough to conceal something more than coins and handkerchiefs. Miss Langford. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said, her voice light, professional. "I believe there's a matter that needs addressing. It concerns a young girl under the informal care of the late Miss Eliza Damford." Miss Marple stepped into the hallway. "She's not alone anymore." Langford's expression didn't change. "I'm sure she's not, but the matter is complicated. She was placed under confidential terms. Her reappearance presents difficulties." "Whose?" Miss Marple asked. Langford's lips thinned slightly. "There are protocols, Miss Marple. You understand? Discretion was agreed upon by all parties. That discretion is now compromised." "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that the compromise came when someone sent a forged letter to a dead woman's cottage in the hope of recovering or destroying evidence. And when that failed, they resorted to surveillance, and, perhaps, worse." Langford did not blink. "We all do what is necessary." "I doubt the law would frame it that way." Langford glanced past her toward the drawing room. "The child has no papers, no name. She does not exist officially. She is a memory of an indiscretion. That memory can still be removed." Sir Alan appeared behind Miss Marple, his voice like a blade. "Number she isn't." Langford's expression shifted, not to surprise, but to calculation. "Sir Alan," she said, bowing her head slightly, "I see you've chosen to involve yourself after all. I should have years ago, but I'm here now, and if you attempt to take her, if you lay a hand on her, I will go to the press myself." "You won't," Langford said softly. "You've spent a lifetime building a name." "I'll trade it," he said. "Gladly." For her, Langford studied him. Then she turned to Miss Marple. "You've been clever, but this will not go away cleanly." Miss Marple's smile was slight, almost kind. "Number it will go away honestly. And that, Miss Langford, is the better end." Langford met her gaze for a moment longer. Then, without another word, she turned and left, her footsteps clicking down the vicarage path like the punctuation to a chapter closing. Inside, the fire cracked gently in the hearth. The girl had not moved. She sat with her hands in her lap, eyes lowered. Sir Alan crossed to her once more. "I want to do this right," he said. "No more hiding. If you'll let me, I'll see that your name is restored, that you're seen." She looked at him, then at the stone on the windowsill, and slowly she nodded. From her place near the door, Miss Marple felt the shape of the story settle at last. Not into perfection, but into truth. And sometimes that was enough. Miss Langford did not return. Whether she left Little Compton by motorcar that very night, or simply receded into the folds of government corridors where shadows passed for policy, no one could say. But her absence lingered like a snapped wire, no longer seen, yet humming faintly with what might have been. For a full day afterward, the village returned to its careful routines, and though the postmistress whispered of an official-looking woman seen boarding the early train, no one could confirm it, and no one, not even Mrs. Weatherby, dared ask aloud. Inside the vicarage, the girl slept. It was the first unbroken sleep she had known in weeks, perhaps years. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, knitting untouched in her lap, watching the logs collapse in the hearth. Across from her, Sir Alan stared into the fire, a cup of cold tea balanced forgotten on his knee. "I always thought," he said quietly, "that guilt would feel heavier. But it doesn't. Not now." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly once before falling still. "That's because you've carried it so long it turned into habit. When you name it, when you step into the light, it stops being a weight. It becomes something else." He nodded. "I wonder what she'll want from me." "Children seldom ask for what we expect," she said. "They want truth and steadiness and no more vanishing acts. I can give her those." She will believe it when she sees you do it." In the early afternoon, a visitor arrived. Celia Turrell, her face flushed with the urgency of someone who had run rather than walked, stepped into the vicarage hallway, holding an envelope in both hands as if it might combust. "It was left at the library this morning," she said to Miss Marple. No return address, just the initials ED on the flap. Miss Marple took it, heart tightening. She broke the seal carefully and drew out a single page of elegant, upright script. Eliza Damford's, without a doubt. The ink was faded slightly at the edges, as though hurriedly penned and sealed in secrecy. If anything should happen to me, she must know. She was always meant to find her own name. I kept the record. It is in the hymnal, the one I never lent, inside the front cover. Tell her not to be afraid of what she learns. Her story is hers to claim. It was unsigned. Miss Marple folded the letter and rose, already moving toward the coat stand. Sir Alan looked at her, uncertain. "Eliza left us one more key," she said, "and I believe it's been waiting in the church all along." The chapel stood cool and still beneath the vaulting timbers, the dust glinting faintly in the slanted light. Miss Marple moved with care, walking down the aisle until she reached the organ bench. There, beside the rack of hymnals, she found it, a dark blue cloth-bound book with worn corners and the smell of old polish. She opened it. Inside the cover, tucked beneath the flyleaf, was a small folded paper. The ink was the same, Eliza's. On it, a name. Clara Damford Hexam. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she turned the paper over. Attached with a single pin was a birth record, one that had never been filed with the county clerk, but had been signed by a midwife in a quiet village near Heathenley. The child had not been nameless. She had been Clara, a name Eliza had guarded with quiet resolve, waiting, perhaps always knowing that someday the girl would return to claim it. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage just as the sun broke through the thinning clouds. The girl was seated in the kitchen with Mrs. Allerton, carefully shelling peas. Her shoulders no longer curled inward. Her spine was straight, her hands steady. Miss Marple entered, holding the hymnal. She set it gently on the table. "There's something here," she said. "That belongs to you." The girl looked up and saw the name written on the folded page. She read it without speaking. Then her lips parted just slightly. "Clara," she said softly. "That's me." Miss Marple nodded. "It always was." Clara read it again, slower this time, like someone tasting something they'd been denied for years. "I used to pretend my name was something," she whispered, "but I didn't know what." "You know now," said Miss Marple, "and that makes it yours." Sir Alan entered then, stepping carefully, and stood in the doorway watching her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Clara turned to him. "Is it real?" "Yes," he said. "It's yours. You don't have to hide anymore." She nodded. Then, after a pause, she held the page out to him. "You keep it," she said, "so you don't forget." His hands trembled slightly as he took it. By that evening, the decision had been made. Clara would remain in Little Compton for now, under the care of the Allertons, with Sir Alan visiting daily as he made arrangements for legal guardianship. No headlines, no scandal, just paperwork and small, steady steps. Miss Marple sat once more in her drawing room, the quiet now no longer laced with tension, but something nearer to peace. She reached for her notebook and turned to the final page. She wrote one line. The child beside the grave came to find herself and was found. She closed the book. Outside, the lane was empty. The church bell rang gently in the distance, and a girl called Clara, who had once waited in silence, now watched the world with a name in her heart and a future slowly unfolding. It was nearly a week later when Miss Marple found herself once again in the sun-dappled churchyard, where the hedges had been trimmed and the grave of Eliza Damford now bore a small cluster of wild violets. Clara had placed them there that morning, without a word, before leaving with Sir Alan for the solicitor's office in Heathenley. She had taken the folded record with her, the name pinned inside her pocket like a secret no longer needing to be hidden. Miss Marple stood in the quiet, her cane tucked under her hand, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The village had returned to its rhythm. Miss Weatherby was once again suspicious of her grocer. The vicar had resumed his sermons on humility, and not a single person mentioned the storm that had passed through them. But Miss Marple knew better. She always did. It had not been the most dangerous crime she had encountered. No bloodshed, no body in the library, no pistol found beneath a cushion, but in its quiet way, it had been one of the gravest. For the erasure of a child is a kind of murder too, slow and cold, done not with hands, but with silence. That evening, as the light waned and the tea cooled on the tray beside her, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room with Reverend Allerton and Mrs. Bantry, both of whom still bore traces of the astonishment they had carried through the week. "To think," Mrs. Bantry said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, "that she was here the whole time, that Eliza kept the truth so close." "She was very precise," Miss Marple replied. "She saw what the officials chose not to, that the child's protection would not lie in forgetting her, but in preparing her." "She might have lived her whole life without ever knowing," Allerton murmured. "She might have," Miss Marple said, "had someone not decided to intervene at the last moment. Had Miss Langford not sent that letter." "You were right," Mrs. Bantry said. "She wasn't trying to return the girl. She wanted to erase her." "She hoped," Miss Marple said, "that Clara would run or be frightened into disappearing again. It was her last attempt at tidying away a loose thread. But the child didn't run. She waited, and that, in the end, gave us everything." There was a long pause. Outside, the rain began to fall again. Not heavily, just a soft patter against the pane. "You saw it all before the rest of us," Allerton said. "No," said Miss Marple, setting down her cup. "Not all, but I saw what mattered. The footprint at the grave, the child's stillness, the man in the crowd who did not approach. I've found in life that when people go very quiet, it is rarely because they have nothing to say. It is often because they've been told they aren't allowed to say it." "And Eliza?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "Why didn't she ever tell anyone?" "Because she understood human nature," Miss Marple said gently. "She knew the child wouldn't stay hidden forever, and when the time came, the right people would either step forward or reveal themselves by trying to keep her hidden. And she was correct." Mrs. Bantry sat back. "It's odd, isn't it? I keep thinking of how it began. Just a girl beside a grave." "And how many passed her by?" Miss Marple said. "Because she wasn't crying, because she wasn't demanding to be seen." She stood then, slowly but with purpose. The fire crackled low in the grate, and outside, the village lights blinked gently on. Clara's story would not be news, not in the way some expected. There would be no scandal, no headlines, but there would be a future. And that, Miss Marple thought, was justice of a different sort. She turned to the window and looked out into the street. The child who had waited beside the grave was no longer waiting. She had stepped into the world, and the world, for once, had made room, 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 had made room,